thank you very much for inviting me, Colin. It's really an honor to be here at the Institute and also with David and Tom. And I also had the great opportunity to meet your great interns here before. We had a wonderful discussion, so it's a great compliment to the Institute and to you recruiting such incredibly smart and sharp, I assume, future leaders here today in Australia. I actually didn't come from the United States just for this panel. Let's be clear. I don't want to be given that kind of credit. I actually moved here a month ago, so I'm actually living here full time. So it is. Now, maybe after my presentation, you'll try to deport me, but I do have the Consul General here as my. So what I wanted to do quickly was, I'll have a quick few remarks to make, but I thought it would be useful just to go through it's 5 quick slides to give some folks some background about how this crazy system works. So you probably know from particularly the 2000 election, because everybody around the world watched that with bated breath to see who was going to actually be chosen. You know all about the Electoral College, or you've heard that mentioned. To win the US election, it's essentially a 50-state election. Every single state has almost its own election. And you need 270 electoral votes to be chosen president. Out of a total of 538, which we get to because each state of the 50 states has 100 senators, so each state gets 2 senators. There's 435 members of our House, and then the District of Columbia, which probably you all visit when you go to Washington, D.C., which has no representation in the House or the Senate, gets 3 electoral votes. Almost, to me, the big difference and the thing to underscore is that Americans don't have to vote, unlike in Australia. So the entire election is about the 2 parties trying to get their base out, their supporters, and then the middle, the independents and the moderates. And a really great turnout. Where an election, a lot of people come out as like 55, 56% of the eligible votes, which is an absolute shame and a tragedy, but that's true. Unlike here, where voting is compulsory. Now, this is a little small, so I'm going to explain this. Every 10 years, we go through something called a census. And the most important thing about the census is it redraws the congressional lines, and it moves, potentially, electoral votes, which are important in an election, from one state to another. And we just went through that process. And the yellow or amber color are states that lost electoral votes. And this is actually in blue. The darker shade is the states that gained electoral votes, and the rest didn't change. Now, what's important about that is 2 things. One is there's a continued trend where population in the United States is moving more or less from the industrial Northeast to the South. The one exception is Louisiana. Anyone want to guess why people lost? Katrina. A lot of people who left New Orleans never came back. And so Louisiana is an anomaly in the South. It lost one electoral vote, but the rest, you can see the trend. Now, why that's important is this. Pay attention to this. 8 out of the 10 states that lost electoral votes were states that voted for Barack Obama in 2008. 5 out of the 8 states that gained electoral votes were states that voted for John McCain, including Texas, which gained 4 electoral votes. Now, I don't care if the unemployment rate is 0 in the United States of America. Barack Obama is not going to win the state of Texas. I guarantee you that. So if there's a close election, and it's possible there might be, that is an important point. Quickly, this is what the election looked like in 2008. The one observation I'll make there, to the right is the percent of the popular vote, how many percent of people had voted, and the other number is the electoral votes. You'll note that the percentage of the people, the difference between the actual people vote is not that great, but the Electoral College is significant, almost 2 to 1. And it's been more often the case than not that Electoral College totals are landslides, or large majorities, larger than the difference between the actual vote. Now, this is the last point I want to make on the last slide. This map was put together by a good friend of mine named Celinda Lake, who is one of the leading pollsters in the United States, has been doing polling for a long time. She does something called a battleground poll with a Republican colleague of hers. You've heard of the blue state, red state thing, right? Okay, so the blue states are states that basically people think are in Barack Obama's pocket right now, including the state of New York, where I'm from. In 2008, if you were living in New York State and you weren't watching national TV, you did not see a single political ad at all. And the candidates of both sides never showed up there, except to come raise money. They didn't show up. They don't show up to those states. And the red states are the same thing, but on the Republican side, all the red states are states that are projected to be states that will go for the Republican nominee, whoever that might be. The ones that are tan, if that's the right color, are what's called the battleground ones, the ones that are going to be fought off. Now, I don't agree with this map because it includes states like Indiana, North Carolina, Missouri, which I don't think Barack Obama is going to win. I don't think he has a chance in hell of winning Indiana, but there's 18 states, that's one person's view. Obama won in 2008 during a very big Democratic year. He won in Indiana by 25,000 votes. That is not going to be a state he's going to win, and he's not going to spend any time there. So let me now make quick points and then turn it back to the following. Barack Obama wakes up every day in the White House and says, "I'm the luckiest man on the planet." And the reason he does that is because he's thinking, and many independent voters are thinking, that the Republican candidates are nuts, are lunatics. And that the debate in the Republican Party is scaring the hell out of independents. It's not important that there's a vicious battle within the Republican Party in terms of the party itself. They will get past that, as Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton did in 2008, because the overriding thing in the Republican Party is to defeat Barack Obama. But if you're an independent voter, and you've been watching tens of millions of dollars of ads in key states, like Michigan and Florida, that are going to be important in the general election, the Republicans scare the hell out of you. And it already is being shown in the polling. I'm going to jump ahead very quickly. Polls now mean very little. We talked about this before. To try to make a prediction as who's going to win, it would be crazy to do that. I will make 3 quick points. No one knows what crisis is going to come. If gas prices go up, Barack Obama's in deep trouble. Remember this state-by-state thing. When you watch the polls that say Barack Obama's doing very well or the economy's improving, it doesn't matter so much what the national poll says. Because if you're in Michigan and you have no job and the unemployment rate in your state is a double digit, it doesn't matter to you if the national poll says that things are getting better. Florida has the highest foreclosure rate of any state in the United States. It doesn't matter if people say housing is drifting up, because in Florida, you're in deep trouble. So the polls that you have to start watching are really after Labor Day, which in the United States is the first week of September, when you begin to start seeing the shape of the race state by state. That's the thing to watch. And the last thing that we do not know is the effect of the super PACs. Something dramatically different has happened this year, where essentially the campaigning in the United States has been a corrupt system for a very long time. I ran as a candidate twice. I can tell you that from personal experience. It has gotten even more corrupt and even more broken. When 5 or 10 people can essentially write checks of 10, 20, Sheldon Adelson, a casino billionaire, is saying that he will write a check for $100 billion. The Koch brothers are willing to write just unlimited checks. The amount of money that is going to be poured into this race is huge. And we cannot predict now, no matter what the other policy analysts say about the economy, gas prices, what the effect of those super PACs is going to be. Just remember what happened to John Kerry. In 2004, you had George Bush, who dodged the draft, who was by many accounts a coward. They managed to paint John Kerry, who was a war hero, who had been wounded in the war, a coward and someone who should not be trusted. And they did that for one reason and one reason only. They had money to spend on ads that were basically misrepresentations and lies. So the super PACs is something to watch. That, I think, is going to be very fundamentally a game changer that we have no track record on. and will fundamentally change the shape of the race. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, and thank you all for being here. I want to say, first of all, thanks for identifying me on the extreme right. I have to say, polite response is, thank goodness you didn't say I was on the extreme left. But it reminded me of a piece I wrote in the Age newspaper, which is the Melbourne equivalent of the Sydney Morning Herald, about 6-8 weeks ago. And it was just after New Hampshire when Ron Paul did very well. He scored third in Iowa, and of course he came second in New Hampshire. And the Age commissioned me to write a piece on Ron Paul. So I thought I'd try my hand at a bit of irony. Irony is always dangerous. And I started off by saying, this is Ron Paul, the Texan congressman, he rails against the American empire that brought the September 11 attacks on us, quotes. He condemns Obama for killing Osama and for failing to shut down Guantanamo. He's indifferent to attempts to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons. He defends Julian Assange and lauds Bradley Manning, the soldier accused of leaking US secrets to WikiLeaks. True patriot. And he is barred from addressing a Jewish forum because of his, quote, misguided and extreme views on Israel. And I go on to say, who is this crazed left-wing radical? If you're not closely following the Republican presidential race, you might think he's Noam Chomsky or Michael Moore. In fact, he's Ron Paul, the free market crusader, cultural conservative and intellectual godfather of the Tea Party movement from, of all places, Texas. And he's also the only Republican candidate other than Mitt Romney to place well in two very different electorates. Now, I wrote the piece and they published it, and then the next day the headline, and I, as a former editorial and opinion editor, know that headlines can get you into all sorts of trouble. The headline read, eccentric left-wing radical and unlikely Republican candidate. Which is not really what I was saying, I was trying to be ironic. Then lo and behold, the comment section of The Age, and you know these days with the internet you can read the comments to the articles that appear. The various comments said, Switzer doesn't know what he's talking about, Ron Paul's not a left-wing radical, and on it went. And I let it go through the keeper, but then I kept getting inundated with people thinking that I don't know my politics. So I politely called one of the editors of The Age, and I said, look, I don't usually do this. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that big a deal, but I really don't think that Ron Paul's a radical left-winger. And then we had this debate, and they made the point that if you read the article closely, with some qualifications, I'm actually quite sympathetic to some of what Ron Paul says on foreign policy. To which he replied, but how can this be? How can you be sympathetic to Michael Moore and be a right-winger? And I think it's just a reminder that in politics, and especially in America, the ideology, these things are very complicated to put things in pigeonholes. I think left and right go beyond ideology, they go beyond simplistic labels and crude divisions. As Colin mentioned, he's quite right. We, one of those lucky people, I suppose, where we have our head in both America one week and then our head in Australia in the last week. And I have been shocked in the course of the last 2 months when I do interviews. It's always prefaced with, Tom, how do you account for these Republicans? Aren't they so nasty? I mean, fancy Newt Gingrich calling Mitt Romney a Massachusetts moderate and a liberal Republican. I mean, this is heresy in conservative circles. How outrageously rude. And of course, Newt Gingrich being called a Washington insider and whatnot. And I just thought to myself this week, it's nothing compared to the Prime Minister or a former Prime Minister being called by one of his colleagues as a psychopath. or a complete and utter fraud, as Kevin Rudd was called last week by some of his former ministers. I think it's also a reminder of two things. One, that in politics, many times your enemies are on your own side. It's a famous quote by, I think it was Churchill in the 50s, who said to a young freshman parliamentarian, son, folks opposite you on the other side of the Treasury benches are your opponents, folks behind you are your enemies. I think that still stands the same on both the Republican scene and the Australian Labor scene. But I think it's also a reminder that conventional wisdoms can all too often be wrong. The conventional wisdom in America is that the Republican Party is so divided. Intra-party warfare will mean that Obama is laughing in November to a re-election. I think that's more or less the conventional wisdom. And I think a lot of Republicans and Conservatives coming to grips with that possibility. This is now the conventional wisdom. Likewise in Australia, the overwhelming conventional wisdom, if you read the papers today and all the commentary over the last few days, is that the Labor Party is cruising for a bruising at the next federal election. But the lesson is that the conventional wisdoms are all too often wrong. And in this 24/7 relentless media saturation of politics, whether it's cable television or the internet, just the general nightly news, events can change things so dramatically. And I just turned to a classic example. In 2008, 2009, when Barack Obama won a very impressive victory over John McCain, and the Democrats won huge majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the overwhelming conventional wisdom, primarily among Liberals, but even among some Conservatives, was that this would witness a new hegemony, if you like, for liberal America. James Carville, some of you may know of him, the former senior advisor to Bill Clinton. He wrote a book, 40 More Years, How the Democrats Will Rule the Next Generation. The leading left liberal journalist Sam Tannerhouse of the New York Times, George Packer of the New Yorker, predicted the death of conservatism. They wrote books on this subject. New York Senator Chuck Schumer visited the conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page and told the editors, cooperate with the new liberal democratic agenda or be irrelevant. Time magazine's cover put the Republican elephant under the headline, Endangered Species, with a subheading, how Republicans have lost their way and won't come back. That's the conventional wisdom. Democrats had something like 60 seats in the Senate, huge majority in the House, and of course President Obama was pushing a fairly liberal interventionist agenda, legislative agenda. And then of course, what did we see 24 months later? Huge Republican gains in the House of Representatives. 63 seats I think the Republicans gained in the House. And of course, they came very close to gaining the Senate. And then all of a sudden, the conventional wisdom was overturned, that we're witnessing a new era of Reagan-Bush conservatism in Washington. So I just say all this in the current context of not just what people are saying now about President Obama, but also what they're saying about the Australian Labor Party. Circumstances can change very quickly. I take a contrarian view on this year's election in the United States. I think you always have to qualify yourself when you're making these kind of calls. Talking to several of the interns before, and one needs to qualify their argument so much, otherwise they might look like a complete and utter goose. It's one thing to look like a goose, but you can always say, I did have a butt in there somewhere. And these are my 5 or so reasons why I think that the Republican candidate at this stage, I think, is probably going to be Mitt Romney. But again, it's still speculation. Big day tomorrow in Michigan, why I think it will be Republicans. First one, the GOP field. Well, look, any field of primary opponents always looks weakest at precisely this moment, apart in December, January, February, and early March. This is when the infighting is at its worst and nobody really looks presidential. Conventional wisdom is that they're uncharismatic, uninspiring, gaffe-prone, scandal-plagued, serial flip-floppers. This is Romney, Gingrich, Santorum, and Ron Paul. All of these barbs have been hurled at these candidates. That reminds one Washington Post columnist of, quote, that famous bar scene in Star Wars. Now, I think all of that could change, as it often does, during a long election year. Remember, the election's not held until November. Trial by fire, as Obama himself is well aware from his contest with Hillary Clinton in 2008, can make a candidate stronger. Okay, so that's my first point. And the second point, I think this is the most important point in many respects, is the economy. We've all heard the expression, it's the economy stupid. It's according to candidate Clinton's campaign team in 1992 against President George H.W. Bush. I think this is especially true this year. The economy is very weak, and given Europe's fiscal crisis, it's unlikely to experience a robust recovery by November. Now, true, there are tentative signs that the bleak unemployment outlook could improve, and indeed it has improved. It's come down now from 9.2% 4 or 5 months ago to now 8.5%, so it is trending downwards. And it's certainly true that I think economists think it'll probably keep coming down, maybe 8.3, 8.2. But then there are also a lot of economists who don't rule out the idea of a double-dip recession, especially with Europe's crisis. But one of the big caveats, as Jonathan points out, is gas prices. If they rise to $5 a gallon this summer in America, as many have predicted, it could wreck the economy and certainly wreck President's approval ratings, as they arguably did last summer. Not since the Great Depression has a president faced worse unemployment. That's a very key point. Not since the Great Depression has a president faced worse unemployment. Another point I think is worth bearing in mind is the role of the independents. We so often hear about Democrats and Republicans. The independents represent a pretty sizable chunk of mainstream middle America. And the key independents who favoured President Obama back in 2008, a lot of them have turned against him in key battleground states. Now, it has changed admittedly in the last month or so as the unemployment rate has come down. But the folks I'm talking about are in those suburban seats in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida. They're the key battleground states. Whoever wins those states is almost sure to win the election in November. And I think the other point to bear in mind is independents more often than not do lean right. They're not hard right or extreme right like I am, but they do lean right. All the available public polling evidence indicates this. If you look at Gallup, 40% of Americans identify themselves ideologically, for what it's worth, as conservative. 40% conservative. Only 20% identify themselves as liberal or left liberal. The rest, broadly speaking, are in the middle of the road. They would identify themselves politically as centrists and independents. Fourth point to bear in mind is some history. Karl Rove makes this point that since NBC began, the television network NBC began asking the question in 1989, no president has won re-election with as many as 70% of Americans, 70% of Americans saying so far out from an election that the country is on the wrong track. Extraordinary figure, 70%. Nor has any president been re-elected when only 13% are telling Gallup that they are satisfied with how things are going in the country. Now, you could make the counter-argument that many of these same folks who are upset with the direction America is going in are also unhappy with Republican candidates. But nevertheless, historically speaking, when so many Americans are bogged down in what I would call a cultural crisis, because they are after questioning this sort of progressive mission of America, then I think the incumbent has problems. And we saw that dramatically in the late 1970s with Democrat President Jimmy Carter, as well as in the early 90s with Republican President George H.W. Bush, the last two first-term presidents who did not get re-elected. The one before that was Herbert Hoover in the Great Depression. Fifth, Congress. Well, we've already talked a bit about that, but I think it's a fair chance that the Republicans will gain the House, although their 25% majority will be slightly reduced. And the Senate, again, a great deal of debate. It's now poised at 52-47 for the Democrats. A lot of seasoned observers in the United States, such as Michael Barone, predicted that the Republicans will marginally get control of the Senate. So I think, in that sense, it's interesting. If the Republicans move to capture the Senate, regain the House, there could be a movement on for a Republican candidate. Now, to be sure, this is where the qualifications are very important. President Obama, it must be said, is in the enviable position of having no real intra-party opposition. I think this is a very important point. You may recall President Bush Sr. in 1992 had a challenge from the right by Pat Buchanan, and I think that hurt him badly for the fall. And likewise, Jimmy Carter in 1980 copped a challenge from the left, none other than Senator Ted Kennedy. Now, President Obama does not have that problem. Although, admittedly, the liberal base of the Democrats is very, very uneasy about much of Obama's agenda. We'll talk about that later. He also has a lot of campaign cash. A lot of people think he'll have up to $1 billion, which will be a heck of a lot of money. That's a record, and that would be more than a 3-to-2 ratio margin over the Republican challenger. So I think those qualifications are worth bearing in mind. Still, it would be very foolish, I think, to overstate the president's re-election chances. Thank you.
Well, it's been 50 years since John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic to be elected. And it's fair to say that Mitt Romney might want to be the Mormon John F. Kennedy, the man who breaks the stained glass ceiling. Now, John F. Kennedy, when he was running, faced a great deal of hostility on the part of Protestants. Even though he got elected, he still got elected with one of the lowest Protestant votes in history. And he faced an enormous amount of suspicion that he would basically be doing the will of the Vatican. And so to try and allay this suspicion, he spoke to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, a group of Protestant ministers, one night in September 1960, and I just want to read a few words that he said. He said, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president should he be Catholic how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote. Where no church or school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him." Kennedy went on, "I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all." 52 years later, we have Rick Santorum, who is in with a serious shot to become the first Catholic nominee from the Republican side. And he would be, I think, only the fourth Catholic nominee at all. And he talked about Kennedy and Kennedy's inspirational speech. He said, "I almost threw up." Kennedy threw his faith under the bus in that speech. When he was pressed about this remarkable statement 2 days ago by George Stephanopoulos, he said, "I don't believe in an America where the separation of church and state are absolute. The idea that the church can have no influence or no involvement in the operation of the state is absolutely antithetical to the objectives and vision of our country. To say that people of faith have no role in the public square, you bet that makes me want to throw up." This comes on the back of a week of extraordinary religious fire-breathing by Rick Santorum. In the same week, he said that American universities weakened the faith of young people, and that was why Barack Obama wanted them to go there, so that he could mould them in his secular image. He also made comments about Obama's phony theology that many interpreted as a return to the dark rumours of 2007 and 2008 that Obama is in fact a Muslim. And also, one of the major issues of the last 4 weeks became the Obama administration's refusal to extend an exemption to a healthcare mandate which would require all employers, including Catholic hospitals and universities, no, not the church itself, to provide insurance that would cover contraception and the morning after pill for all of its employees. Now, all of this religious talk seems to have begun a revival for Rick Santorum. It was on the back of this that he won 3 states. In the primary, he won 3 states that are where the Republican electorates are dominated by evangelical Christians. And this has forced Romney, who for reasons we'll get into is usually not very comfortable discussing religion, to actually try to manoeuvre to the right on this issue. So in the debate in Arizona last week, when Romney was asked about the contraception mandate, he said, "I don't think we've seen in the history of this country that kind of attack on religious conscience, religious freedom, religious tolerance that we've seen under Barack Obama." Now, of all the flip-flops I've seen from Mitt Romney, I never expected a Mormon to say that this was the worst example of religious persecution in American history. Just as a reminder of some things that happened to the Mormons. Joseph Smith, incidentally, the founder of Mormonism and the first Mormon to run for president, had his presidential campaign cut short by being killed in 1844 by an Illinois state militia. This was after the Mormons had been forced out of 4 states at gunpoint, including a full-blown war in Missouri when the governor in 1838 actually issued a genocidal extermination order against Mormons. Missouri His governor realised in 1976 that this was actually still on the books, and he hastily removed it. In the 1880s, when the federal government was trying to stop the Mormons from practicing polygamy, they actually passed a law saying that any polygamist, which in effect was all Mormons, because all Mormons believed in the righteousness of it, that no polygamist could vote, hold office, or serve on a jury. Okay, now I would say actually this is the worst attack on freedom of religion in American history, not the contraceptive mandate. And this brings us to the many dilemmas of Mitt Romney, what he's trying to negotiate as he works his way through this process. In 2007, 2008, he took a fairly different tactic. He actually consciously modelled himself on Kennedy, this man whose grave Santorum is now spitting on. He decided that, like Kennedy, he would actually have to openly come out and confront the issue of his Mormonism. And he didn't know, no one really knew, what effect Mormonism will have on a presidential candidate's chances. Okay, there's a lot of Americans who don't believe that Mormons are Christians, and that could pose a real problem for some people in voting for a Mormon. So Mitt Romney had to come out in 2008, and he believed, like Kennedy, make a statement saying that his faith would not affect the way that he governed. Okay, this turned out to be a mistake. All it did was put the word Mormon in people's heads. And when it put the word Mormon in people's heads, it put all the, tasteless jokes about polygamy. It put all the long-buried ancestral doubts about these people in people's heads. So he's taken a very different approach this time around, which can basically be summarised as mention it as little as possible. Now, I mean, his whole demeanour has changed. The last time around, he travelled with his wonderfully large, telegenic Mormon family, his 5 sons. It was like watching the Osmonds go on tour. He made jokes, sometimes ill-advised ones, about Mormonism. He really talked about it a lot more. Now he talks about it a lot less. He talks about religion a lot less. He actually comes to the electorate with a very kind of traditional northeastern or midwestern Republican set of concerns about creating a very stable business environment. He doesn't have a lot to say about even foreign policy, and he certainly doesn't seem to want to go on any social crusades like Rick Santorum. But now he finds he actually can't escape the issue of religion. And what to an outsider looks like a bizarre kamikaze attack by Rick Santorum on every aspect of American modernity, there's actually a strategy to this. And that is getting religion back in people's heads again. This nomination race, many of these nomination races coming up, are going to be very close. Michigan tomorrow is basically line ball. Santorum could even potentially win it on the basis of Democrats voting for the person who they think will be the least electable candidate. Romney has been the putative frontrunner, but people are finding it really difficult to muster enthusiasm for him. I mean, the poor guy, he keeps getting front-runner status, and then the Republican electorate turns around and says, oh, maybe we should give that cactus a turn. Maybe that would be more charismatic. But what Santorum has done now is to put religion back on the table. And many Americans, even if they have doubts about Mormons, even if they certainly wouldn't want to be a Mormon, maybe wouldn't want a Mormon to be their neighbour, it may not play a huge role in the way that they evaluate their presidential candidate. There are too many other things jostling for attention in people's brains. And so what Santorum, I propose, is trying to do, I've got no evidence that this is true, but what I would have advised him to do, if I was his political consultant, is to put religion back in the top of people's heads just at the time they're evaluating between religious candidates. And what he's basically saying is, do you want the true Christian? Because, hey, for at least the last 30 years, evangelicals have accepted Catholics as Christians. Or do you want the guy who you're not entirely sure is a Christian? And that, I think, is the kind of obstacle that Romney is facing right now.
gas prices. I mean, I think, unfortunately, I say this as an American, with all due respect to the council, most Americans don't care what happens abroad, except how it affects their pocketbook. The one exception might be that in their perception about how the president acts, let's say if there's a foreign policy crisis and somebody looks incompetent or doesn't respond well, that could affect the way people perceive in this case, it'll obviously be the president, and if the Republican nominee tends to say something foolish. But I think it's really about gas prices. They'll only care about Iran or Afghanistan, so if gas prices go up and someone can tie that to Obama's foreign policy.
Yeah, I've been struck by, with the exception of obviously Ron Paul, how the other mainstream Republican candidates, Mitt Romney, Gingrich and Santorum, although on the one hand I think they're quite right to talk about reducing the size of government, especially cutting spending, because America has these huge debt to GDP ratios, these debt mountains of Himalayan proportions. But I think it's fundamentally incompatible to say, let's reduce the size of the state and cut spending on the one hand, but then on the other hand talk about increasing the defence budget. And although they express themselves in different ways, that's exactly what Gingrich, Romney and Santorum are advocating. I mean, in many respects, Gingrich is worse because he describes himself as a hawk, but a cheap hawk. Now that is an oxymoron. If you're going to be a hawk, you want to sort of spread your wings a bit, and you need a bit of ammunition and resources. You've got to feed the hawk to be hawkish, but you can't do that if you're trying to slash the federal Leviathan at home. So I think there's a very fundamental disconnect there between some of these Republicans. And the other point I'd make is that on Afghanistan, totally incoherent. Mitt Romney gave a speech in June, I forgot where it was, but he made the point that he supported the idea of reducing American troops, withdrawing American troops, all 90,000 of them, as soon as possible. Now, you know, that is far more dovish, if you like, than certainly Barack Obama or Julia Gillard. Now, he's backtracked a bit since then. But I think it's just a reminder, and you see this with the Ron Paul campaign, there are a lot of Republicans and indeed Democrats who are very nervous about the notion that America can impose its will and leadership across the globe. We talked about this earlier, but to the days of unparalleled American power, economic and military in the 40s and 50s and 60s, those days are over. So when Mitt Romney talks about a new American century, it's going to be very difficult to do that when the resources at home aren't there, but more importantly, the will at home isn't there either.
By assassinating Osama bin Laden, Obama's taken away part of what would almost certainly have been a frontal attack by Republicans on his weakness on foreign policy. I mean, since the day that he was elected, Republicans have been screaming, this guy's weak, he's submissive to Muslims, he's a secret Muslim, he's not on our side in the war on terror. Yeah, I mean, some of them are still saying this stuff. I think that Rick Santorum the other day said America's enemies feel safe under Barack Obama, and well, he should probably go to the bottom of whatever ocean they dumped bin Laden at and ask him how safe he's feeling at the moment. Obama has actually carried out the war on terror in a particularly cold-blooded way, and his critics on the left point out that he may have become more efficient at slaughtering terrorists or anyone in the vicinity of terrorists, but in some cases he's basically followed Bush foreign policy. So it's going to be very hard, I think, for the Republicans to really mount an effective attack on him that way, although it's not going to stop them from trying.
Let me just quickly, whenever you hear, two quick things, whenever you hear Republican defined as a war hawk, none of them went actually and served in the military. When Dick Cheney had to serve, he had other priorities. He was perfectly happy, though, to send other people to die. So the hawks are not hawks when it comes to their own personal safety. And I never thought I'd say this, but in defense of Ron Paul, he, along, as we discussed before with the U.S. Council, he, along with one of the most liberal members of Congress, Barney Frank, who actually is not running for re-election, has proposed a $1 trillion cut in the defense budget over 10 years. Now, I think that's not enough, but he has taken a position that is now on at least defense spending much more broadly accepted beyond his isolationist views. There's only 2 states that do that right now. It's Nebraska and Maine. And what they do is they award their electoral votes based on who wins the congressional district. So Maine has 2 members of Congress, and Nebraska has 4, I believe, by memory. And so, in fact, Barack Obama in 2008 won 1 electoral vote in Nebraska. Maine went completely one way. I don't think there's going to be a strong movement. It certainly will not affect the election in 2012.
First on Iran, yes, I have been struck. There are, as you well know, 3 main traditions within the Republican foreign policy. There's, if you like, the neoconservative, more interventionist, hawkish school of thought. There's the more realist, balanced power school of thought. And then there's more, if you like, neo-isolationist school of thought. What strikes me about the 3 main Republican candidates is that they subscribe more or less to the neoconservative view that preemptive strikes is the way to deal with rogue states, even if they have weapons of mass destruction or are developing the capacity to develop WMD. Whereas the realists in the tradition of President Bush Sr. And Presidents Nixon and Ford, and indeed President Eisenhower at the height of the Cold War in the 50s, believe that deterrence and containment can keep rogue states in their box. Because although deterrence can't work against terrorists who can run and hide, nation states or rogue states still have fixed assets. They have a mailing address. And if the Iranian leadership ever used weapons of mass destruction against Israel or American interests in the region, it would guarantee massive retaliation. So containment can work, and I think that's one of the lessons we should learn from the Iraq War. Saddam could have been contained. On the question, I think you're probably a bit hard here on the Republicans generally. Let's be quite frank. I don't think any country in the world would have this kind of level of transparency. I mean, there have been, I lost count of how many debates they've had, but it probably close to 20, more than 20, I would have thought. Is it actually 20? Okay, now 20 debates is a heck of a lot. Now, it does seem like more because we've been watching them than they've been on, but yeah, 20 debates. Now, admittedly, the first few debates probably didn't count as much because you had a lot of unconventional characters, you know, the scene from the bar scene from Star Wars, but nevertheless, I think that Romney, Gingrich, Santorum and Paul, they've been exposed on all sorts of fronts, and I think that this has been a healthy thing for a democracy. And I do think that a lot of voters in America, remember the voting percentage will increase probably this year, just like it has in the last 3 presidential years. I think there's been more awareness of the candidates' positions, particularly with things like the internet, 24/7 cable, and even Twitter and things like that. So I do think there's more transparency there, and I think you're probably being a little bit tough there on the Republicans. Just to be a contrarian.
It is. Americans are often surprised by how much we know about their politics. I mean, I've lived in Michigan for 6 years, and one comment I often heard was, wow, you know so much about politics, I know nothing about yours. And, you know, that applies to the entire world. And, yeah, for us, the Republican debate is a bizarre spectacle, where you're like, wow, these guys want to shrink government and restore it to its proper role in people's bedrooms and on the moon. I mean, what is, you know, what on earth is going on here? But Richard, it's not actually bad advice that they're getting. It's not that they're not conscious of the effect this has on the rest of the world. It's that it is deliberate strategy in Republican primaries to say, look, I've got to be the right guy. Those Europeans hate me. You know, the Republican Party has, you know, at least since the time of Bush, possibly before, modelled itself so much as the anti-Western Europe. And you'll hear every candidate say, we don't want to become a European secular welfare state. That, you know, the worse impression they make on the rest of the world, the better it is for them.
So 2 things. First of all, the Republican debates have been entirely superficial. And I don't care how many debates they had. Part of that has to do with the entire incompetence of the journalistic community in the US. They ask completely superficial questions. And the questions that are answered mostly are completely canned and, you know, they're not debates. They're small 1-minute campaign speeches. So with all due respect, I strongly disagree. We've learned almost nothing that they don't want us to know. The second thing is on the specific question about foreign policy. The United States of America, both parties, has spilled a lot of blood in this world. And it's not just the Republicans. Remember, it was Barack Obama who said Iraq was a mistake. We should be doing the good war, which was Afghanistan, which in my opinion was just as bad a disaster. Joseph Stiglitz estimates that those two wars together will cost the United States somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion when you take all the costs of the debt, the cost of veterans and so on. Think of what that money could do to heal society, to do other things in the world.
It's a plausible observation that you and the BBC have made. I think there are a lot of, I mean, you know, a lot of the racial groups, for example, particularly African Americans, are overwhelmingly Democratic and more or less the same for the Latino voters. Although, mind you, Governor Bush in Texas was popular with a pretty significant segment of the Latino Hispanic community. But I get back to the point that I raised in the more formal talk. Those opinion polls are pretty consistent. And if anything, they've improved for conservatives. In the Obama era, that poll I gave before, in 2009, at the height of liberal dominance in Washington, 40% of Americans identify themselves as conservative, 20% liberal, the rest, 30 to 40% more independent or centrist or non-identified. That number actually went up on the eve of the midterm elections, 20 months later, to 53% conservative and 18% for liberal. So I think ideologically speaking, America is still very much a centre-right nation despite demography. For those of you students in particular who are interested in this question about what makes America so different from particularly Western Europe and indeed Australia, ideologically, brilliant book. I can't recommend it enough. It's by John Micklethwaite and Adrian Woolsridge. They're both the editors of The Economist magazine. They're Brits. And the book is called The Right Nation. And it was published in 2004. And it is undoubtedly the best explanation for why American conservatism, and America at large, is so different from other English-speaking countries around the world.
You are absolutely right. The Republicans are staring at a demographic inevitability. And this is a quote from Ed Gillespie, who's a leading Republican strategist. If the Republican nominee in 2020, that would be 8 years from now, gets the same percentage of African American, Hispanic, and Asian American votes that Senator McCain got in 2008, the Democrat will win by 14 points. So I disagree with Tom. What the Republicans are arguing, which is an anti-immigrant, very hard-line position, the Republican establishment is very worried about that. That's why you see calls for Jeb Bush to enter the race, who's considered to be somewhat more normal or moderate on immigration and other issues. If they continue that posture, they will be a minority party by 2020.
It does. It's important to remember that the Jewish vote is only 2% of the population now. It's declined at its peak. It was about 5%. And the problem in terms of overall influence is that it's currently concentrated in Democratic strongholds. New York, California, Massachusetts, Illinois. The one place where Jews are really important swing voters is Florida. And we will remember the tragedy that occurred last time in Florida, where they had a particularly confusing ballot, whereby thousands and thousands of Jewish retirees managed to vote for Pat Buchanan, who, I mean, he's been called an anti-Semite a lot. I mean, he's certainly one of the less Israel-friendly candidates.
Congress is Israeli-occupied territory.
That's right. Yes, he called Congress Israeli-occupied territory. In these elections, it doesn't matter much. If it mattered more, the Democrats would be winning every time because they get the Jewish vote about 5 to 1. And the more the Republicans attack urban elites, people with too much education, people who live on the coasts, the less Jews are going to want to vote